Hello, colleagues. So welcome to meeting number 15 of the Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development. Pursuant to the motion adopted on January the 31st, the committee is meeting on its study of vaccine equity and intellectual property rights.
Interpretation is available through the globe icon at the bottom of your screens. And for members participating in person, please do keep in mind the Board of Internal Economy's guidelines for mask use and health protocols. Je profite de l'occasion pour rappeler à toutes et tous.
I would like to take this opportunity to remind all participants to this meeting that screenshots or taking photos of your screen is not permitted. Before speaking, please wait until I recognize you by name. When speaking, please speak slowly and clearly. When you are not speaking, your mic should be on mute. A reminder that all comments by members and witnesses should be addressed through the chair.
It gives me great pleasure to welcome now our first panel of witnesses before the committee and to thank them for agreeing to take the time to be with us this morning. We have with us from Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, Dr. Seth Berkley, Chief Executive Officer. Welcome. And from the United Nations Children's Fund, UNICEF, Lily Caprani, Head of Advocacy and Global Lead for Global Health, Vaccines, and Pandemic Response. Welcome. Colleagues, we are also waiting to hear from Dr. Ayoade Alakija, who is the Special Envoy and Co-Chair of the ACT Accelerator. She's on our witness list this morning on behalf of WHO. She has some technical problems with respect to a connection, and we're hoping that she'll be able to join us in the course of our discussion this morning. And with that, I would like to give each of our witnesses 5 minutes for their opening remarks, after which we will begin the discussion with members. Dr. Berkley, if you would like to lead us off, please, on behalf of Gavi, 5 minutes for opening remarks. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'm hearing an echo. Is that?
Try again, sir. It should be okay.
Yeah, let me. It was the translation. So honorable parliamentarians, distinguished guests, thank you for inviting me here today. I'd like to thank the Canadian government for being such an incredible long-term and ongoing supporter of both COVAX and Gavi. Just earlier this month, you renewed the support at the Gavi COVAX AMC Summit with additional pledges, bringing your total advanced market commitment to around Canadian $800 million. This has helped provide vital support with vaccine procurement, deliveries, and ancillary costs, as well as committing to donate the equivalent of at least 200 million doses through COVAX by the end of 2022. In addition to this, Canada has provided critical help with the design and operationalization of the dose sharing mechanism. All of this has played an essential role in helping COVAX deliver more than 1.4 billion doses of COVID-19 vaccine to people in 145 economies, with the vast majority, nearly 90%, going to the 92 lower income advanced market commitment countries that otherwise would have struggled to get access. Through the Gavi COVAX Advanced Market Commitment, or AMC, this equitable access to COVID-19 vaccines has been absolutely critical to protecting people and increasing coverage in lower income countries. Today, on average, 44% of people in these countries are now protected with 2 doses. While this still falls well short of the 59% global average and 70% global target set out by WHO, it is incredible progress compared to just 6 months ago. But clearly, we still have a long way to go. While many wealthy nations like Canada have coverage above 80%, and some are now offering 4th booster shots, in lower income countries, it's a very different story. Currently, 18 countries still have coverage lower than 10%. This is a huge improvement on just 3 months ago when 34 countries were in this position, but even so, many are still struggling with their rollouts. So even though many countries with high coverage have now relaxed restrictions and reopened their societies, we are still in a state of global crisis. So far, a new variant has emerged roughly every 4 to 5 months, and globally, nothing has changed to give us reason to believe that this pattern won't continue. With 2.7 billion people still unvaccinated, the virus continues to have ample room to circulate and mutate. This means that the threat of resurgences or new and potentially more dangerous variants still hangs over us and will continue to do so until global coverage increases and more people are vaccinated. Until recently, the main challenge has been supply. Vaccine hoarding, export restrictions, and manufacturing delays have seriously hindered global access. But now global supply is ramped up and access to doses is no longer the issue. One reason for that is the successful use of technology transfers during the pandemic. By sharing not just intellectual property, but also vital know-how that is essential to the production of vaccines, technology transfer have played a critical role in enabling us to get such large volumes of doses so quickly. So while COVAX supports any efforts aimed at increasing equitable global supply, waiving intellectual property is only part of the solution, and it's questionable whether by itself it would have the same impact. It's also important to remember that IP is an important part of vaccine development and is absolutely critical for innovation, which is the main reason why so many COVID-19 vaccines have been developed, with more than 24 vaccines already in use, hundreds more in clinical and preclinical trials. Diversifying global supply remains important, and Gavi and COVAX are committed to it. When Gavi first began its work in 2000, there were only 5 suppliers, mostly in industrialized countries. Today, there are 18 suppliers, the majority in developing countries. Moving forward, the best and most sustainable way to achieve this is through the development of regional manufacturing sites producing a variety of global, regional, and locally relevant vaccines, especially in Africa. For now, though, COVAX's greatest challenge is no longer supply, it is coverage. The reality is many countries are struggling with their rollouts to turn vaccines into vaccinations, and that is where our priority must now lie in ensuring that these countries get the right vaccines and the right volumes at the right time. That means providing support so countries can scale up their delivery systems, increase absorptive capacity and demand. This is what it will take them to get doses out to people faster and ultimately achieve their targets. Although we must help countries achieve their national targets, it's critical that we get high coverage of high-risk groups, healthcare workers, the elderly, and those immunosuppressed or with comorbidities. Right now, we estimate a coverage of about 75% for healthcare workers and 57% for those over 60. This is not good enough. The pandemic is not yet over, far from it. So it's imperative that countries use the doses available for them to protect as much of their population as possible, starting with those most at risk. The good news is we now have enough supply to not only help them meet these national targets, but possibly even exceed them. I'd like to end by thanking Canada for its incredible leadership, support, and ongoing partnership to help make that possible. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much for your opening remarks. We will now go to Ms. Caprani for 5 minutes, please. The floor is yours.
Good morning, and thanks so much for having me, distinguished guests and parliamentarians. UNICEF, as you know, is the United Nations Children's Agency, and we're very proud to be the lead delivery partner for COVAX. That's everything from procuring vaccines to delivering the last mile and making sure that vaccines get into arms. A lot of what I'll say may underscore what you've heard from Dr. Berkeley, that the journey from the last 2 years has taken us from a position where there were insufficient supplies of vaccines to be able to achieve coverage at the rates needed to protect populations around the world, to today's problem where we have sufficient supplies, but we're still unable always to turn those vaccines into vaccinations and protect the most vulnerable populations around the world. The pandemic is far from over, as we know. A new variant continues to emerge every 4 months or so, and the threat is not over. either to those vulnerable populations or to any country, even with high vaccine coverage. It remains in our enlightened self-interest to continue to press for global cooperation and ensure that all vulnerable populations around the world receive the protection they need from severe illness and death, and to reduce the ongoing disruptions to other essential services. One of UNICEF's chief concerns is to make sure that the ongoing response to the pandemic doesn't come at the cost of other essential services, including routine childhood immunization, access to education, access to primary health care, and all of those essential functions that protect children's lives now and their opportunities in the future. As part of the vaccine global rollout, we've seen ongoing challenges to achieving a supply chain. And throughout 2021, as we know, the biggest challenge was making sure that low and middle income countries could access vaccines. And that inequality, the stark inequality in access to supplies, has to some extent been addressed with thanks to the global leadership of high-income countries, including Canada, generously funding COVAX and the ACT Accelerator and donating doses when vaccine supplies were not available. But as you've heard from Dr. Berkeley and others, today's challenge is primarily one of deploying those vaccines and making sure they reach the people who need them most. And in order to do that, we need far more attention and investment on the delivery challenges. It's no good just delivering vaccines. The product themselves, they need to get from the tarmac and into arms. And in order to do that, we need sustained efforts to invest in health system capacities in the lowest income countries in the world. We know that most of the countries with the lowest levels of coverage face many competing demands. And I hope we will take a moment to put ourselves in the shoes of health ministers in low and middle income countries that face conflict and security challenges, competing health emergencies, constrained budgets, insufficient healthcare workforce capacity, and many other competing challenges, and find practical ways to help provide the technical assistance, the operational assistance, and the funding needed to overcome those hurdles. If we don't do that, we will not achieve the coverage needed to protect those countries and all of us around the world. In order to do that, we need to address some critical bottlenecks that are becoming more and more clear. One is we ask Canada and all supporters of COVAX to join in demonstrating support for those countries to continue to be able to politically prioritize the COVID response in the face of these other competing challenges. In order to do that, they will need predictable supplies and predictable arrivals of vaccines and other countermeasure products. They'll need sufficient funding to be able to support a highly trained, well-protected and properly paid healthcare workforce ready to deploy these vaccines in communities that need full risk communication and engagement so that populations are fully aware of where to access vaccines and can do so from a trusted, well-equipped and well-trained healthcare worker. In order to achieve this, we would ask Canada to continue its global leadership in investing not just in procurement of vaccines, but in the delivery of vaccines and the last mile challenges, and to do so in a way that does not come at the cost of other essential services. Just to underscore how essential this is, we're seeing for the first time in more than 10 years a reduction in the number of children that are receiving routine immunization and the largest number of children who receive no vaccines at all. As a consequence, we're beginning to see outbreaks of other vaccine preventable diseases that will cause further disruptions and further strains on those healthcare services. So an investment in delivery of the COVID-19 vaccine is not just an investment in tackling the pandemic, but protecting the health of all from other diseases at the same time. Further, we know that evidence from the Vaccine Delivery Partnership, which WHO, UNICEF and Gavi are part of, shows that this is one of the main reasons that countries are struggling to prioritize the COVID-19 vaccine rollout. So I don't want to repeat too much of what's already been said, but I'd like to underscore that investing in capacity to ensure there's further geographical diversity of manufacturing, intellectual property rights being lifted is one way. As you've already heard from Dr. Berkeley, all of the agencies involved in the COVAX rollout will support anything that encourages the lifting of barriers to expand the capacity and diversity of availability of vaccines. However, the TRIPS waiver, which I know is the mechanism under discussion, is probably neither necessary or sufficient to achieve this. Thank you. I'll end by saying thank you again for the leadership of the Canadian government and for your generous contributions. The pandemic is far from over. It's a risk to health services everywhere and global health security. It's also a great opportunity if we use this pandemic response to invest in sustainable expansion of healthcare capacity everywhere. Not only will that help end this pandemic, but protect future generations from future pandemics.
Thank you so much, Ms. Caprani, for your opening remarks. We will now go to our rounds of questions, and just for the benefit of our witnesses, these are very carefully timed and in some cases very short rounds. And I've started to use what I typically use, which is a signal with 30 seconds of questioning or speaking time remaining. If we can just sort of stick to that, it'll help us to navigate the rounds of questions that are ahead of us. The first round consists of 6-minute segments, and leading us off this morning will be Mr. Genuis for 6 minutes. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses. Dr. Berkeley, are you seeing developing country leaders expressing preferences with respect to the kind of vaccine that they receive? Do you have instances of people declining certain brands of vaccine or seeking some over others? And what are the reasons that are being given for those preferences?
Sorry, Mr. Chair, do you want us to respond
Yes.
immediately, or are we waiting?
Yes.
Oh, sorry.
Please, Dr. Berkeley, just go directly to the member's question. It's basically up to the member to navigate his or her speaking time.
Okay. So the answer is yes, we are seeing preferences. When we started, there was basically people wanted any vaccine at all. And so people were accepting a full range of vaccines. They were getting them from different sources, and they would also accept vaccines that had relatively short shelf lives when they came by donations. That has since changed, and countries who have experience with vaccines have chosen to use a particular vaccine. An example would be the AstraZeneca vaccine, which was very important at the beginning. Recently, there has been less demand for that vaccine, not from all countries, but for some, and particularly countries do not want short shelf life vaccines because it doesn't give them ample time for planning and making sure that they can get the doses out to the periphery. So what we do is we offer every country, now COVAX is offering a 6-month timeline of doses coming forward. And with that, they get to choose their priority vaccines. And also in donations, we've asked that donations come with at least 2 months of shelf time in country, to be able to be provided as doses.
Thank you so much, and you sort of answered my next question as well, which was about expiry of doses. I recall the case in Nigeria where I think something like 1 million doses had to be destroyed. Would you be able to provide us maybe in writing with a sense of which particular kinds of vaccines are being sought after and which ones are not, kind of as just a sense of what countries are asking for? Would you have those documents available to share with the committee at a later point?
We do have that information. Obviously, we have plans for every single country. The good news is right now that there's been a pretty broad distribution of vaccines, both mRNA vaccines as well as vectored vaccines. In the past, we've used some inactivated vaccines, but those have been in less demand. We now have adjuvanted proteins, which have not yet taken off, but we expect over time, as people understand the characteristics of those, that they will be taken up. But we can submit that.
Thank you very much. I want to ask you about the impact of indemnification clauses in vaccine contracts in the developing world. I know that that our country, our government, has signed indemnification clauses around claims that might be made against vaccine manufacturers. What is the application of those clauses if Canada donates vaccines to countries in the developing world? Do developing countries sign their own indemnification clauses? Do those clauses not apply? Could you shed some light on that issue, please?
So one of the things that we did early on was to set up new mechanisms to work in a pandemic, many of which surprisingly weren't set up before. One of them was a standardized indemnification liability agreement. We got all of the manufacturers to agree to that, and that has now been approved by all of the countries that are receiving COVAX doses. So when the doses that Canada donates are then transferred to the COVAX facility, it gets covered by those indemnification and liability agreements. One other thing that we've done, which has been really an innovation, has been to have a no-fault compensation scheme set up for all these countries as well. That allows countries to have, in the case of severe disease or death from a vaccine-related effects, to go ahead and receive certain amount of financing available, and that is funded by a certain price on each dose of vaccine that is part of the COVAX facility. That covers both the doses that COVAX purchases, but also the doses that are donated through the COVAX facility.
Okay, thank you. Just to clarify, that no-fault compensation package then is paid for by the purchaser of the vaccines. Every government or actor who's purchasing doses, a portion of what they're paying is going into that fund for no-fault compensation.
No, that's not correct. What we're doing is we are paying for it as part of the COVAX assets that exist. And so a country can, if they want, as part of their donation, pay for the delivery cost, ancillary cost, et cetera. But what's happening is we are using the financing we received to pay
Sorry,
costs.
thank you. I'm going to get one more question before my time's up, which is how much has been paid out of that no-fault compensation fund so far? And if you don't have the answer, could you provide it in writing? Thank you.
Yeah, there have not been, I can't give you the exact number, but there have not been a lot of claims on that account.
Thank you very much, Mr. Timmins.
Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Berkeley. We will go to our next intervention. Mr. Isasi, please, for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Allow me to start with Dr. Berkeley. Dr. Berkeley, as you know, the WHO did previously estimate that by this summer, they were setting a goal of vaccinating 70% of the population of every country. Where are we insofar as that specific target is concerned? And do you believe we can meet it?
So first of all, I did go over the numbers in terms of global average. The numbers are at 59% of vaccination with 2 doses. And in terms of the AMC 92, that's the 92 lowest income countries, that number is now 44%. I also went over the fact that there are some low coverage countries that are still less than 10%, 18 of those now. It is very unlikely that those countries will be able to get to 70% by the middle of this year. It may be possible that countries will get to 70% by the end of the year. Some countries have set goals that are far beyond that, talking about mid-23 or later. So we have to rely on what the countries choose as their goals, not a global aspirational target for coverage, and that's what we do, is work with each country on what their goals are. Of course, the one thing I emphasized in my remarks is that we want to make sure that the high-risk populations, the healthcare workers, elderly, and those with comorbidities, are vaccinated. And today, that means not just primary doses, 2 doses, but also boosting. Boosting has come up late in the WHO recommendations, and that's something that, again, countries are working on now.
Thank you for that. Now, as I understood it, in your testimony, you were saying that supply is not a challenge at this particular point. But we heard from Ms. Caprani that there are a number of different bottlenecks It appears that the greatest bottleneck is actually building capacity insofar as healthcare workers is concerned. I know that Canada actually has set aside quite a bit of money for capacity building, but what is it going to take for the international community to achieve that objective of building a more professional workforce in various countries to make sure that we can meet these targets?
So first of all, I think what Lily was particularly talking about was these low coverage countries. There are many developing countries that actually have done pretty good in terms of increasing their coverage and getting to high coverage levels. But there certainly are countries with weak health systems. 15 of the 18 countries that haven't gotten to 10% yet are fragile countries. And in those circumstances, there haven't been adequate investments, and there's usually not adequate finances to do that. Of course, immunization is the most widely distributed of all health interventions. And as Lily suggested in her testimony, this is something that we've been working on, is building sustained and resilient health systems in all countries. But of course, in countries that have fragility, that have problems or warfare, it is very difficult to do that. So financing is part of the solution, but also critical is going to be good governance and the ability to access all populations. And these are things that we're working with, not just with the partners that we talked about here, but with humanitarian partners, civil society, and others to try to make sure we can enhance those systems.
Just in terms of enhancing those systems, as you put it, would it not be fair to say that financial assistance alone is not going to be sufficient, and there has to be more experts that can assist these countries bring their systems up to the standards that are required? Because, as you know, many countries have provided assistance of a financial nature, but maybe more is required to make sure that we can move forward.
When we talk about assistance, we talk about financing, we talk about technical assistance, we also talk about technology assistance. So one of the things that's important is to build better technology, have better data systems, better ability to have supply chains that are resilient. This is all part of what we talk about in building capacity. And it's why in fragile countries, it becomes even more difficult than it is in countries that are, relatively stable, where that investment over time can be sustained. An example would be in a country like Syria. We saw a very, very strongly functioning health system and immunization system get completely destroyed, including the cold chain, the supply chain, and everything. And so at the end, it really was about rebuilding it and tolerating the fact that in that type of situation of war, that it meant we were going to have to continue to invest.
Mr. Sassi, you've got about 30 seconds. You can get a
quick
one in if you've
I thought you indicated I didn't. But again, I just want to return to this. Perhaps if we can hear from Ms. Caprani, how do we ensure that the workforce is there and that we are doing, as members of the international community, we are doing our part to build that capacity? And it seems to be the critical question.
I would agree it is one of the most critical components to expanding capacity. We do need a significantly larger primary healthcare workforce, not just in order to tackle the pandemic, but in order to catch up on the lost gains in routine immunization and to rebuild those highly disrupted healthcare systems. It will take both domestic investment of resources and better coordination and alignment by international donors as well. So I think that in terms of the role of a government like Canada, both by investing in those delivery challenges and leading by example, and using your influence in fora like the G7 and the G20 and the UN General Assembly to convey that message to other donor partners, that coordination and a very clear focus on investing sustainably in the primary healthcare workforce is going to be one of the most important tools, not just in ending this pandemic, but preparing for the next one as well.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Essasi. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sessi. Thank you to the witnesses, and I would now like to give the floor to Mr. Bergeron for 6 minutes. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I hope you hear me well. Thank you to the witnesses for being with us today and to be giving us their comments. The director, in Foreign Affairs Director, said what you seem to be confirming today, that is in 2021, there was a problem in terms of supply and the offer, and now the problem is now in terms of what's being requested. And we're having difficulty finding use for the vaccines that are available. Mr. Sassi was saying there was a lack of qualified personnel, and other factors are also there. There's also the cold chain, which is a factor which can be difficult to get to small villages that are remote. But we also see in certain countries there's a reluctance to be vaccinated. And last 1 million children have been vaccinated against paludism. And we now know that 6 million people, roughly, in Africa are being vaccinated. We'd have to go to 36 million per week to be able to get to the necessary percentage of coverage. And so my question is, are we seeing the same type of hesitancy with vaccination towards malaria with what we're seeing with respect to COVID?
Is quite different. Malaria was only recently recommended as a vaccine by the WHO steering committee. Prior to this, we were doing a pilot study to see how the vaccine could be implemented in the community. Would people continue to use bed nets, given the fact that the vaccine is not 100% efficacious, and with an understanding that, in fact, people continue to use bed nets and could get good coverage, it's recently been recommended. It has not been rolled out more generally. The challenge for malaria vaccine, there's been enormous demand, but the challenge has been that at the moment there is not a large amount of supply of the vaccine. There's been difficulties in manufacturing of it. We are working to try to see if the vaccine can be scaled up in larger quantities, as well as having other manufacturers come in with other vaccines as well. On your broader question of hesitancy, the hesitancy for COVID has been worse than other vaccines, partially because it's been politicized in the West. And so they share the same mass communication platform, social media, that we do in the West. And what we're seeing is the rumors and the misinformation that is spreading, causing hesitancy. Of course, the partners on the ground are always working to try to make sure people have the right information, that local political leaders and healthcare workers are working to try to provide that information to overcome that hesitancy. But it is a bigger challenge with COVID-19 than we've seen with any other vaccine to date.
Does that include the vaccine for malaria?
There has not yet been a campaign to roll the vaccine for malaria out. There is a current effort looking at how the vaccine will be rolled out, given the fact that there is not adequate supply for everybody who will want it. So there will be an allocation mechanism that is going to look at places that have the highest incidence of malaria combined with inaccessibility and therefore most usefulness until there's more availability of that. Something that we also had to do with the COVID-19 vaccines at the beginning when there were not enough doses available. I suspect Lily might have some things she'd want to say on this as well. I don't know if you'd like to give her a voice as well.
Bien sûr.
Of course.
Thank you. On the issue of vaccine demand, and I'm using the word demand, not hesitancy deliberately, I think it's very important that we don't fall into the trap of assuming that lower than ideal demand and uptake is entirely about hesitancy around the product or the science of the vaccines. The evidence doesn't support that. And in fact, multiple institutional surveys across countries in Africa have found that the vast majority of people, when asked whether they intend to get vaccinated, say yes, they do. So when we ask them, well, why are you not yet vaccinated? The reasons are more complex than simple hesitancy. Often it's a matter of convenience or understanding or having the right information as opposed to some sort of principled objection to vaccination. And while hesitancy is real, it's often overstated as one of the problems with demand. So a couple of things can be done to improve that situation. One, as we've mentioned, is the kinds of risk communication and engagement with communities that allows them to access reliable information, often via a community-embedded healthcare worker, will go a great deal of the way towards addressing it. And secondly, making accessing these vaccines convenient by bundling and integrating it with other health systems will also make a huge difference to uptake and demand. That's not to say misinformation isn't a challenge, it is, but it's important that we don't put all of the blame on that. It's a misunderstanding of the situation on the ground.
Merci beaucoup. Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bergeron. Thank you to the witnesses. Madam McPherson, now 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'd like to thank the witnesses for being with us today and sharing their expertise with us. This has been very, very interesting. I think I would start, if I could, with Ms. Caprani. You spoke a little bit about the impacts on countries outside of the vaccines, like the trickle down, I guess, of the impacts. One of my big concerns that I'm feeling with this is that, first of all, that the world has changed focus, that they have, now that the developed world or that countries in the north have reached fourth doses, have increased their vaccination, that there's this sort of feeling that that COVID-19 is over, that we can change the channel, that we can turn the page. And I think both our witnesses today have made it very, very clear that we are not out of this pandemic and that variants will continue to develop. So my question, first of all, is one of my worries is that ODA will be impacted, so that countries will see their vaccines as a portion of their ODA, which means that there will be less ODA dollars available for things like healthcare, other healthcare initiatives, education, support for women and girls. Can you speak about that worry and whether or not that's founded and what we can do to prevent it?
Yeah, thank you. Okay, I guess two separate points. The wider impact of the pandemic on developing countries, especially their health systems, but other essential social sector provision is an enormous concern, especially for UNICEF, because of the way children are a kind of hidden victims of the pandemic. Although they haven't been at greatest risk of severe illness and death from the pandemic, have suffered extensive closures of essential services, backsliding in routine immunization, lack of access to newborn and maternal health care, school closures, and really will bear a generational cost of the pandemic response, especially if investments in other investments, like other forms of ODA, are reduced in order to pay for the pandemic response. The pandemic response needs to be additional to, not instead of, continued and sustained investment in health, education, and social protection services. And that continues to be in the interests of all high-income countries as well. This should never have been and is not a matter of charity or generosity, but it's in the enlightened self-interest of all to continue to make these investments. We're also beginning to see alarming, as I mentioned, alarming backsliding in progress that was hard won over more than a decade. and the return of outbreaks of other vaccine preventable diseases, which have significant knock-on effects on the health system and on communities surrounding those low coverage areas, including measles and now polio as well. This kind of reversal of progress is entirely avoidable, and it is a very concerning side effect of not having sustained investment throughout the pandemic. I don't want to get too off topic, but we're starting to see the same kinds of worrying trends in the provision of nutrition services, for example, as well. So yes, it is a huge concern. And while we know that the OECD DAC rules allow donor countries to offset some of these pandemic donations and payments against their ODA, we would strongly encourage donor governments not to do so, and to recognise the long-term impact that will have on hard-won gains in health and development.
Thank you. Thank you. No, and I think it's such an important point that we are talking about in addition to, not instead of. That's a vital thing that I'll certainly be pushing for. My next set of questions actually is for Dr. Berkley, if I could. Dr. Berkley, there's been a little bit of it's been a bit opaque for us to understand exactly the situation with regards to Canadian doses that have been donated. You know, we have heard that there's a commitment for 200 million doses. We have seen some dollars. The additional dollars in the budget were, of course, very, very welcome. And we've talked about giving or the government has talked about giving approximately 87 million to date. Can you give us some actual numbers of where those doses are, what that looks like? Because from what I understand, the only ones that I can actually find and put my finger on are those 21,600 doses that went to Madagascar, and I would like more clarity on that if I could.
So I don't have all the information in front of me, but in terms of doses that I am aware of, there were 10 million doses of Moderna, which were provided, 12 million of J&J, about 22 million doses of AstraZeneca, and 7 million of Novavax. Now, some of those donations were ultimately returned because of short shelf life, but the vast majority of those have been delivered. I don't have a breakdown in front of me about which countries those went to, but my understanding is that Canada did not earmark those doses, and therefore it has gone in the general supply to the 92 countries that need it.
And if you could provide those numbers in writing at a later date, that would be fantastic. But it does seem like it is a fraction of the doses we'd like to see. The very last question, I know I'm running out of time, but a very quick question. What would have been the result on the vaccine rollout if the TRIPS waiver had been accepted when South Africa and India asked for it at the very beginning of the pandemic? We're 2.5 years in and we still have not agreed to that. What would have been the impacts if we had agreed to that much sooner?
And just a brief answer, please.
None. I mean, the critical issue is know-how. Patents have not been the blocking factor here. And so, of course, you need to have access to any patents, but they can even be worked around. The critical issue for biologics is know-how. If you don't have the know-how, Moderna has said that they're not going to, block their patents from the beginning, but nobody's been able to make the Moderna vaccine because they don't have the know-how. It's the know-how that's critical.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Ms. McPherson. We'll now go to our second round, and just in the interest of time and our second panel, I would suggest that we compress our allocations to 4 minutes and 2 minutes, respectively. If that's okay with colleagues, I would like to ask Mr. Abel-Taif to lead us off, please, for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks to our witnesses. I hear an echo. Thank you again for appearing before the committee this morning. Dr. Berkley, you've mentioned about some vaccine brands that had less demand, such as AstraZeneca, and there's some vaccine were rejected because of short shelf life. And both actually bad news, because really there's a waste there that we could be prevented. Will you be able to tell us first how many vaccination were rejected due to short shelf life, and why? Where's the deficiency in the system? Is it the infrastructure? Is it the supply chain? What is it that it causes that waste of vaccination?
So initially, people were very happy to take any vaccine dose, including those with short shelf life. There was enormous demand, and people would take them and use them very quickly. What's happened since is that countries have now gotten access to vaccines, and with those vaccines being in country, they have planned programs and are working on it. If doses show up that have short shelf life, they have to either displace the doses that they have planned to use, or they have to, return those short shelf life vaccines. Some have displaced the vaccines they were planning, but some have rejected them. Of course, we don't, if it's coming through COVAX, we don't provide those doses without first asking whether they'll take them, including what the timeline is. But some donors have provided vaccines outside of COVAX with short shelf life and put political pressure on countries to take them, which has meant if they have short shelf life, they have to go ahead and push out their other vaccines, which may create problems with those.
Will you have the information again on how many of those vaccines or vaccinations that were rejected or were sort of discarded because of that?
Yes, we do have that information. Do you want that for just Canada, or do you want that in general for COVAX?
No, in general, if that's okay. And
Okay.
Hopefully it's detailed by country. Ms. Kaprani, you're the UNICEF, and I was amazed to hear that there's some deliveries or vaccination deliveries that did not go as well or as supposed to go to certain countries, especially the low-income ones or the middle-income ones. Can you advise us on the supply chain at UNICEF as far as, we believe that, an organization such as is well established and you got to have that readiness. So what was the holdback on not being able to deliver all the vaccination on time, especially when they become available?
Yes, UNICEF's supply division is the lead delivery agency for COVAX. That means we are part of the procurement process and delivering, in literal terms, transporting, if you like, or shipping and flying vaccines to countries. In fact, there is no problem with doing that. And I think there has been a misunderstanding when we say delivery challenges, we don't mean transport problems. Often the turnaround time from receiving doses to getting them on a plane and delivered to a country can be as little as 48 hours. There's not a constraint in terms of the transportation, but the process involves a country being ready to receive and accept doses. So UNICEF will never deliver doses that can't be accepted by that country and are ready to be deployed, therefore turned into vaccinations and receiving people's arms. So each country must, of course, tell us they are ready to go before we will deliver vaccines in order to prevent wastage, precisely as we've just been discussing. One way of thinking about it is that we're acting as a matchmaker between available supplies and donors and manufacturers and the receiving countries. And as a matchmaker, we have an extremely high success rate. But where countries are not able to take those vaccines and deploy them, where they reject them due to short shelf life or because they simply haven't been able to mobilize a workforce ready to go, then they will decline. And wherever possible, we'll redirect those vaccines to another country that is ready to deploy them. Unfortunately, sometimes that does result in waste. Obviously, we aim to minimize that. And thus far, it's been very, very low.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Abeltaif. We'll have to leave it there in the interest of time. Ms. Vandenbel, please, for 4 minutes.
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you both of you for your expert testimony today. I'd like to just follow up on a previous question asked by Ms. McPherson and also touched on by Mr. Abeltaif, and that's about how donations are provided, cash versus actual vaccines. And my understanding is that, of course, when there are supplementary doses that a country has that's not needed or options to purchase, there's a mechanism to provide that bilaterally, country to country. But my understanding is that cash donations directly to COVAX, to the ACT Accelerator, are far preferable, because rather than having existing doses that then have to be found in terms of sending those vaccines somewhere. By providing cash, it can be done much more flexibly. It can also add to things like the health systems. And when Canada provides our cash donations of vaccine equivalents, we're also including things like the syringes and everything else that's included, and we're one of the few countries doing that. Can you tell us because I'm looking at numbers, and my understanding, if you include the cash transfers of vaccines, we're well over 100 million already and well on our way to the 200 million vaccine doses that we pledged. And that's not even including the extra $1 billion in budget 2022. Can you talk about whether or not the cash donations equivalent is actually what is most needed right now?
So thank you for that question. And you're absolutely right. Cash is better now. Now, there was a moment in the middle of last year when we were unable to access doses because of export bans from multiple countries, because of vaccine hoarding, et cetera. At that point, donations were a godsend. They were really helpful because they allowed doses to flow. But once we now have the unlocking of doses from manufacturers. And by the way, that's another delay that Lily didn't mention. It is not a UNICEF delay, but we also have to wait for the companies being able to be ready to ship doses and having cleared them, even though they've been produced. And so sometimes the delay we talk about in delivery is that. But, cash is better. Now, that being said, we don't want to see wastage anywhere. Lily talked about internally to COVAX, but we would prefer to see all doses go to a good home. So we have tried to continue to respond to countries that have come to us and said we have doses that are available, as long as we can match them up to what countries want and have the adequate shelf life. But of course, we will not anymore try to push those doses out if the countries don't need them or already have an excess of those doses. And that's really the challenge. So cash gives us flexibility. And thank you, Canada, for providing the ancillaries, syringes, et cetera, for doses, because you're right, some other countries haven't done that. And that has meant we've had to use financing to purchase that.
I'd also just like to follow up in terms of what you've both said about capacity and building up health systems. I noted that in addition to the $732 million extra for the ACT Accelerator in budget 2022, we're also providing $296 million to build up health systems around the world. And can you tell us why this is, I'll start with Ms. Caprani, why this is so important, particularly you're talking about children, you're talking about future pandemics. Why is it so important that we're funding not just vaccines, but health systems?
And just a brief answer, please, in the interest of time.
Thank you. It is absolutely essential, and thank you to Canada for leading the way and demonstrating a willingness to invest in health systems. Often the Cinderella service doesn't get the investment. It's often not as attractive to donors, as harder to measure, but it is absolutely critical. And to give an example, just to illustrate it right off the bat, we receive reports all of the time from countries that are telling us that they're having to divert resources from their current health systems in order to respond to the pandemic in a way that comes at the cost of other essential services. That's why we need to invest in these systems. It's no surprise that one of the biggest indicator of a country's likelihood of having tackled the pandemic and achieved good vaccine coverage is the prior existence of a strong, well-funded, well-coordinated healthcare system. It's the number one way that we will end this pandemic and prevent the next one. And I am concerned that in our pandemic preparedness and response debates and discussions around the world this year, that investment in primary healthcare and in system strengthening still falls to the bottom of the political priority list. And I hope that Canada will help make sure it doesn't.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Ms. Vandenbelt. Monsieur Bergeron, s'il vous plaît, pour 2 minutes.
Mr. Bergeron, you have 2 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Experts from the World Health Organization said at the beginning of the month that one dose of vaccine against the papillomavirus would help give effective immunity against COVID-19. And if that news were to be true, it would be give a lot of hope for vaccination efforts around the world. And also to work against this pandemic and other pandemics. What do you think of this?
Announcement from WHO was looking at through their SAGE, which is their advisory mechanism, HPV as a single dose versus being a 2-dose, and in the past even a 3-dose vaccine for human papillomavirus and cervical cancer. Nothing to do with COVID in terms of where they are. And what they've suggested is that data suggest, although it's not complete, that 1 dose of vaccine will give you a protection for a period of time. Whether it'll be a lifetime or not, they are unable to say at this current time, but they feel that that will be a more cost-effective way of working. And of course, if necessary, to be able to go back and revaccinate at a later time if necessary. We will be following that WHO recommendation and therefore hopefully be able to accelerate the access to HPV vaccines.
Est-ce que Madame Caprani?
Madame Caprini, would you like to add something?
To be clear on COVID-19 vaccines, as Dr. Berkeley has said, the SAGE group of experts constantly monitors the scientific evidence available and updates its guidance. And on COVID-19, we now know that protection with boosters is essential for those most vulnerable populations. And we would encourage all policymakers to follow the guidance of the SAGE experts, which is regularly updated to reflect the latest understanding of the evolution of the virus.
Merci beaucoup. Merci, Monsieur Bergeron. Ms.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Bergeron.
Very much. My first question, I think, will be for Ms. Caprani, if I could. I'm concerned about the vaccination rates internally for countries. So in areas where there is conflict, areas where there is humanitarian crises undergoing, where we have internally displaced people, refugee camps, whatnot, how can Canada assist making sure that the vaccines can get to those communities, to those vulnerable populations?
Thanks. Yeah, I think you heard earlier that the fairly newly convened vaccine delivery partnership is doing country-by-country assessment of the national priorities and the need for very flexible and tailored plans of support for every single country. Of those 18 that remain under 10% coverage, 15 are emergency countries experiencing either conflict or other humanitarian emergencies. And we know from our experience as humanitarian agencies responding around the world for the last 75 years that what we require is very flexible forms of funding so that we can respond in emergencies, and that we need flexible and tailored planning, that we work closely with those governments to adapt to their own local needs. Some of the best examples we've seen of successful and quite rapid increase in coverage rates have been countries where they've been able to bundle and integrate the COVID response into other actions, other humanitarian response actions, other health system actions, rather than having to treat it as yet another vertical response that stands alone. This is not necessarily in the context of a humanitarian emergency, but I know that Ethiopia has managed to increase by 5 times its coverage rate since mid-February by being able to be much more flexible in its planning. And other countries in emergency situations need to be able to do the same. So I would encourage Canada and all donor governments to make sure that funding is delivered in a flexible way and allow the humanitarian agencies to work closely on tailoring the kind of deployment so that it works for local context.
It's interesting what you're saying.
Ms. McPherson. I apologize, just in the interest of time. We've got 2 more interveners. Mr. Genuis, please, for 4 minutes.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Sorry, just a point of clarification. We have an hour with the next witnesses as well, or?
Slightly less. We need to compress that a bit, but I'll propose an equitable distribution.
Okay. All right. I thought we were going to proceed to them so we don't run out of time for them, because I think having time with them is important. But I do have additional questions if possible here. So just following up on my previous questions, Dr. Berkeley, if you could just clarify that the funding for the no-fault compensation mechanism comes from donors to COVAX and not from industry. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. Okay. So there's no mechanism by which industry would be contributing to that.
There currently is no mechanism.
Okay.
Of course, normally industry does pay its own insurance costs for or self-insures against AEFIs. But in the case of novel vaccines and during a pandemic, they weren't willing to do that. And that's why we created this external no-fault compensation scheme.
Is that something that they had asked for?
It is correct that they had requested as part of their indemnification and liability some type of no-fault compensation scheme. Not every manufacturer had asked for that, but that was a desired outcome by a number of manufacturers who also said they wouldn't supply vaccines to developing countries unless there was some type of no-fault compensation scheme.
Does that no-fault mechanism cover theoretically possible cases of bad faith or where misleading information is presented or information is withheld? Does it cover all possible cases of liability, or does it only cover unforeseen or unforeseeable negative events?
It is events that are severe in nature, that are proposed to be related to the vaccine, although obviously one cannot always make a direct connection. So it is run by a commercial insurance operation and managed by them in a way that allows a specific set of responses and therefore specific payments to that for severe side effects and death.
Okay, I guess just to clarify my question, though, does it indemnify companies in cases where information, where they had, a company may have had certain information about side effects, and that information was withheld? Would those indemnification agreements cover a hypothetical case like that?
I would need to check with the lawyers on what the specific agreement is, but that was not the purpose of setting up this. It was not to provide blanket protection to industry. It was to make sure that if there were, as I said, severe reactions to the vaccine, unknown reactions, that there would be a compensation mechanism set up. But if that's an important issue, I could have the lawyers look at what the language was.
If you could, please. And are those agreements public? Have they been released publicly? Can they be provided to the committee, the particulars of those agreements?
I'm not sure that they have been provided publicly. They may be privileged documents, but I can look at that as well.
If you could either provide them to the committee or just provide us with a written update advising with respect to their status, that'd be great.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Genius. We'll have to leave it there. Ms. Bradford, please, for 4 minutes.
So I have just a question for Ms. Caprani. You did mention that you felt that TRIPS was perhaps insufficient. It has worked well, but we need to do more. Could you please elaborate on what more we should be doing in that area?
UNICEF's position is that we, of course, want to see every action possible taken to lift any barriers to expanding manufacturing capacity. And for future pandemics, if we had a more geographically diverse manufacturing base, that would be a good thing. But as Dr. Berkley has said, actually lifting the TRIPS waiver now wouldn't have made a difference in this pandemic. And that's because on its own, it's not enough. In order to expand capacity for manufacturing vaccines, which are not the same as drugs, a much more complex process involving multiple components, we've been very pleased to see voluntary licensing, proactive partnership between IP holders and manufacturers. And where that's happened, it's been because of technology transfer, the sharing of know-how, and voluntary licensing and proactive partnership. And all of those things are essential. Lifting IP rights on its own isn't enough. It won't allow a manufacturer to become sufficiently expert to be able to make vaccines. As we've just heard, the Moderna example illustrates that. So while there's nothing, I think it's very much worth pursuing all avenues to expanding geographic manufacturing capacity in the coming years in preparation for a future pandemic. But the priority during this pandemic has been to encourage proactive partnership, sharing of know-how, technology transfer, and making sure that that manufacturers that are able to produce safe and effective vaccines with appropriate regulatory oversight can do so. And there are plenty of good examples of that happening without a TRIPS waiver.
Okay, thank you for that. Dr. Berkeley, Canada's committed $580 million in support and has been a key champion of the COVAX facility. What more could we do to support COVAX facility going forward?
Thank you for Canada's support. Obviously, finance is important, as Lily and I have both said. But I think what's also important, and Lily mentioned this, is trying to make sure in a major forum, the G7, the G20, the UN General Assembly, the World Health Assembly, et cetera, that this still is prioritized. The challenge, as we heard from some of the parliamentarians, is there is a risk that people have say, this is over, the virus, we're done with the virus, but I don't think the virus is done with us. And therefore, we need to make sure that we can look at multiple problems and emergencies at the same time and continue to have the financial support, political support, health system support that is necessary to build both a strong response now and to be better prepared for the inevitability of a future outbreak, which is an evolutionary certainty, particularly with global warming, increased population, urbanization, et cetera.
Quickly, are there any lessons that can be learned from the successes and shortcomings of COVAX to date going forward for the next round?
For me, there's two lessons. One is have contingent financing available immediately so that we can go ahead and make sure that we get in the queue to purchase doses quickly and have surge capacity. Because I must say that, for example, UNICEF Supply Division, Gavi, all of the people initially had to work with existing staff, and that was overwhelming. People did it because they knew it was the right thing to do, but we need to be better prepared to surge and respond and keep alive all of the lessons learned that we've had from this effort.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Ms. Bradford. Colleagues, on our collective behalf, I'd like to thank our witnesses, Dr. Berkeley and Ms. Caprani, for being with us today. Merci beaucoup de votre témoignage.
Thank you very much for your testimony, for your expertise, and for your service.
And we'll let you disconnect. We will suspend briefly and take on board our next panel. Travel safely, both of you, and thank you again. Merci. Welcome our next two witnesses. For AstraZeneca Canada, we have Kirsten Coombs, the president, and for Pfizer Canada, Fabien Paquette, leader vaccine. Each of our witnesses will have 5 minutes for an opening statement, and we will start with Ms. Coombs. I will give you the floor for 5 minutes. Please go ahead.
Great. Thank you very much for having me today to provide a few brief remarks about AstraZeneca's role in fighting COVID-19. In the face of the greatest health emergency in our generation, I'm incredibly proud of the role that AstraZeneca and our employees are playing to defeat the pandemic and positively contribute to global public health. The pandemic has never really respected boundaries or borders, and it has represented an unprecedented global health and economic challenge. And because of this, in a very early stage in the crisis, AstraZeneca joined forces with the University of Oxford to bring together their world-class expertise in vaccinology with our global development and manufacturing capabilities. And from the outset of this partnership, AstraZeneca committed to providing broad and equitable access to our vaccine and making it available at no profit through the height of the crisis. And I think this reflects our commitment to meet the urgent global public health need that we felt and support health systems and economies recovering from the global outbreak. And recognizing the complexity of vaccine manufacturing and the critical importance of global supply chain, AstraZeneca helped establish manufacturing capacity in 15 countries with 25 different manufacturing sites to supply the vaccine in every region of the world as quickly as possible. And this required us relying on our own manufacturing capacity and sharing our know-how with more than 20 partners, each of whom are now fully equipped to supply the vaccine and contribute to our total output. And in support of global efforts to guarantee rapid, fair, and equitable access to vaccines for people in all countries, AstraZeneca was the first biopharmaceutical company to join COVAX partnership. And taken together, in 2021, AstraZeneca and our global partners have supplied more than 2.6 billion vaccine doses to over 180 countries across every continent, including here in Canada. And approximately 2/3 of the supply went to low and middle income countries, and more than 300 million doses have been delivered to 130 countries through COVAX. And since early 2020, when the true scale of the pandemic became clear, AstraZeneca has committed to helping defeat COVID-19 by harnessing and sharing our scientific knowledge and expertise and advance the development of potential medicines to prevent or treat the virus. As you know, our vaccine, Vaxzevria, has been a critical part of global efforts to defeat the pandemic. It received its first approval for emergency use in December of 2020 and has been granted a marketing or emergency use authorization in 93 countries worldwide, and it includes emergency use listing from the WHO. The vaccine has demonstrated efficacy against all known variants of COVID-19, including Omicron. It is also effective against all severities of the disease, from symptomatic to severe disease and hospitalization. And it's generally well tolerated according to clinical studies and real world evidence from over 10 million patients globally. Over the course of 2021, it's estimated to have helped prevent 50 million COVID cases, 5 million hospitalizations, and saved more than 1 million lives. But complementing our vaccines approach, we also quickly mobilized our efforts to advance the development of Evusheld. It's a novel coronavirus neutralizing long-acting antibody combination for the prevention and treatment of COVID-19. Evusheld is actually the first long-acting antibody combination to demonstrate benefit in both prevention and treatment of COVID-19, as well as the first antibody therapy to have shown a high level of protection against symptomatic COVID in the pre-exposure prevention setting. And while the vaccine is helping us turn the tide of this devastating pandemic, millions of people around the world, about 2% of the population, remain at risk of COVID-19 because they are unable to mount a sufficient immune response following vaccination, such as those patients and people who are immunocompromised. These include people with blood cancers, other cancers being treated for chemotherapy, patients on dialysis, or those taking medications after organ transplant, or who are on immunosuppressive therapies, including medicines for multiple sclerosis or rheumatoid arthritis. So in closing, I hope I have clearly demonstrated AstraZeneca's commitment to helping defeat COVID-19 from the very beginning of the global health crisis, and our commitment has not stopped. We remain focused on providing broad and equitable access to our vaccines and our other medicines. And AstraZeneca remains steadfast in our commitment to changing the course of this pandemic and helping ensure that those countries with the fewest means are able to protect their populations. Because this is a humanitarian challenge that we have, and it demands a global united response, not just from the scientific community, but also from industries, organizations, governments, and really every single person around the globe. And we are committed to continuing to play our part in this public health crisis. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Gomes, for your opening remarks. Maintenant, je passe la parole à Monsieur Paquette pour vos.
Mr. Paquette, you have 5 minutes for your opening remarks.
Members of the committee, bonjour.
Hello. I'm very grateful for your invitation to contribute to your study. From the beginning of the pandemic, Pfizer and biotech have been firmly committed to equitable and affordable access to COVID-19 vaccines for people around the world.
By introducing tiered pricing, we established one tier for healthier nations, such as Canada, where the price was benchmarked to historical cost of the flu vaccine. Then, middle-income countries were asked to pay half of that price, and lower countries were offered a non-for-profit price, which represents approximately 50% of the world's population. Second, we established multiple supply pathways such as direct supply agreements with governments like Canada. To date, we've delivered more than 71 million doses here in Canada. We have direct supply agreements with COVAX. In 2021, Pfizer-BioNTech shipped more than 250 million doses, which is more than 25% of the total COVAX supply, to more than 100 countries and territories. We've supported government donation programs. This includes 1 billion doses supplied to the US for donation to low and middle-income countries, as well as the African Union. And we've also initiated humanitarian donations. Third, we've developed or deployed a reliable global manufacturing network. En date du 17 avril.
As of the 17th of April, 3.3 billion doses of the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine have been delivered to more than 179 countries and territories in every region of the world.
2 billion doses to low and middle-income countries in 2021 and 2022. As of April 17, we've delivered more than 1.3 billion doses to 110 countries toward this pledge. Notre chaîne d'approvisionnement et notre réseau de fabrication.
Our supply chain and manufacturing network spans 4 continents and includes more than 20 facilities. We share our technology with numerous manufacturing partners, including BioVac in South Africa, Europharma in Brazil, and many others. Our voluntary licensing agreements are with partners with a strong track record in quality vaccine production and with the ability to manufacture at a large scale.
Credible voices around the world are recognizing that patents or supply are not the issue. The Africa Center for Disease Control and Prevention have paused all COVID-19 vaccine donations until the 3rd or 4th quarter of this year, stating that the primary challenge for vaccinating the continent is no longer supply shortages, but logistics challenges and vaccine hesitancy. The WHO has reported that many countries are struggling to achieve high uptake of COVID-19 vaccines despite adequate supply. The African Union and COVAX have declined options to obtain vaccines as developing nations struggle to turn supplies into immunization. India's 2 major COVID-19 vaccine makers have halted production of vaccines, citing a high inventory and lack of new orders. To achieve the goal of vaccinating the world's population, we need to focus our efforts where they matter the most. First, in investing in country readiness and addressing vaccine hesitancy. The real solutions to improve vaccine access include reinforcing and maintaining health infrastructures to deliver the vaccine, supporting frontline health workers to administer the vaccine, vaccine hesitancy campaigns to increase acceptance of the vaccine, dose sharing, and removing trade barriers. Ce sont là les vrais et principaux.
Those are the major pandemic issues facing the developing world.
We need to address trade bottlenecks. Export restrictions were a significant trade barrier at the beginning of the pandemic. While they are currently manageable, there is always the risk that they will revert. Finally, continued innovation is of paramount importance. Many companies are collaborating together to support R&D and manufacturing, thanks to the intellectual property and pro-innovation policies. Together, we continue to address COVID-19 by designing additional vaccines that target new variants, conducting research on specific dosages for special populations, such as children, and creating additional formulations that will improve the storage and handling of the vaccine to make it easier to administer in less developed countries. Le principe de la propriété intellectuelle.
The foundation of intellectual property has enabled a strong global supply network with multiple partnerships that maintain high-quality standards, resulting in an industry that is now producing about 1 billion doses of COVID-19 vaccine per month.
Recommendations to the government, I encourage you to recognize that patents are not the obstacle to equity. Je vous remercie beaucoup, and I look forward.
Thank you very much.
In English ou bien en français?
Or in French.
Paquette pour vos remarques d'ouverture.
Thank you very much, Mr. Paquette.
Struggling to manage minutes of time. We can go a little bit past. I know that's not the preference for every colleague. Some of us have commitments at 1 o'clock, but we could go until 1:15. Why don't we start by doing the following? If we pare back the opening round to 5 minutes, that gives us some flexibility.
No, please. I think each party should have 6 minutes to start off.
Okay, it's the preference of the committee. If that's the consensus, we can certainly stick with that. We do have a bit of a constraint with respect to having started a bit late. 6 minutes. Mr. Genius, please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think it's important to start off, Ms. Coombs, by addressing the elephant in the room. There is declining relative demand globally for the AstraZeneca COVID-19 shot. For instance, Africa's most populous country, Nigeria, with a vaccination rate of only 6.5%, still has decided to stop taking AstraZeneca vaccine shots. I wonder if you could tell us if you would recommend the AstraZeneca COVID-19 shot to people that are close to you under the age of 55 based on the evidence that currently exists.
Yeah, so I very much recognize the situation that we have globally with our vaccine, and it is quite prevalent here in Canada. To answer your question directly, I would first and foremost recommend that anybody that's close to me get vaccinated, and get vaccinated with where and however they can. The science suggests that the Vaxzevria, our vaccine, with the side effect profile that it has, is safe to take. And so if that's the vaccine available, I would offer that to my family members. What I will say, though, is anytime you take a vaccine, anytime you take any medicine, there's a risk-benefit profile associated with it that is a very individual choice, and that individual choice has to be made on a person-by-person basis, and it's no different with a vaccine.
Thank you, ma'am. To be very clear, though, Canada's National Advisory Committee on Immunization has issued a statement over a year ago, actually, recommending against the use of your vaccine for adults under 55, relating to concerns about vaccine-induced thrombocytopenia. Provinces have issued similar recommendations. So would you recommend that people follow that public health advice and not take your vaccine in light of what public health authorities are recommending in Canada?
So I would recommend to anybody that, yes, you follow the public health guidance that is given in your local area. And we are very beneficial here, or have the benefit here, that we have other vaccines available to us. So absolutely, I would suggest that following global or public guidance, health guidance, is the way to go. I also know that not everywhere in the world is it the same situation, and the risk-benefit profile, there are global regulatory bodies that suggest that the risk-benefit profile for Vaxzevria is a benefit one, or is beneficial to the individual, and so therefore taking the vaccine is something that is recommended in certain parts of the world.
Okay, but just to follow up on that, I mean, the recommendations we're getting from Canada's health authorities at the provincial and national level are not to take it for those who are under 55. Do you have any evidence to suggest, for instance, that the risk of vaccine-induced thrombocytopenia is lower in certain developing countries than it is in Canada? We're talking about the same disease here.
No, I haven't. I have no scientific evidence to prove that. But I also very much respect and defer to the public health authorities in the local area in which the population should follow the guidance on which vaccines they choose to receive and administer in those areas. That's all I'm saying.
Okay, I think this is a bit of a problem where we have one set of health advice in one country and a different set of health advice in another country, and you're saying, well, follow the health advice wherever you are, even though we're talking about the same compounds. Can I just ask one more question on your vaccine specifically? Was your company aware of the side effect risk profile prior to the statement being released a year ago from the National Advisory Committee on Immunization?
So our organization, when side effects were started to be identified in the general population, you remember this product is a little bit different than a lot of vaccines, and I would suggest any type of pharmaceutical product, in that it was distributed and administered to a wide, diverse population across the globe, almost, in a very short amount of time, much shorter amount of time than usually when you introduce a medicine into the general population.
Sorry, ma'am. I have very limited time, and I'd like to give you all the time I can. But in 10 more seconds, then I've got to ask Mr. Paquette. Were you aware of these risks prior to that statement being released?
AstraZeneca was aware of the risks associated with Vaxzevria at the time in which we made it publicly known. As we follow at any type
Thank you. I'm sorry. I've got to proceed to Mr. Paquette. You can certainly follow up with the committee in writing. Mr. Paquette, you spoke about vaccine hesitancy. In 2009, your company paid $2.3 billion in what was U.S. dollars in what was then the largest healthcare fraud settlement in U.S. history. This was related to allegations that you illegally promoted 4 drugs: Bextra, Gaudin, Zyvox, and Lyrica. I share the concerns about vaccine hesitancy. Do you think that settlements like this have contributed to a lack of trust in the pharmaceutical industry and vaccine hesitancy around the world?
Well, thank you for your question. Actually, vaccine hesitancy is something that has been in place for a long time, as long as there were vaccines out there. So it's not something new. It's something that has been seen. And we see different type of vaccine hesitancies. We see people that are pure anti-vaxxers, people that really will never get a vaccine, while we see other people who are just, looking at getting a little bit more insight, a little bit more understanding, looking at more information about vaccines. So I think that what is critical here is to provide education with healthcare providers giving the right information to the audience.
Sir, I guess...
Thank you very much, Mr. Genius. Okay. That's 6 minutes, actually over. Dr. Fry, please, 6 minutes.
Thank you very much. I want to thank you for coming and providing us with, you're going to get a hard time from this committee, as you well know. But as a physician, I can say that it is well known that different individuals and different groups react to different drugs in different ways. And so one cannot look at a broad consensus and say because something happened to group A that it's necessarily going to happen to group B. And that's the whole thing about the risk benefit profile that tends to happen. But I want to ask you a question. You talked a lot about vaccine hesitancy, and I want to know what you think causes vaccine hesitancy other than fear that it's going to hurt you. I want to also know that you talked again about readiness of countries to be able to give the vaccine, not to produce it, but to be able to give it and get it into populations. And you also talked about the WTO supply chain problems. Now, firstly, I want to know what you think is a cause and what can you do about vaccine hesitancy, education being one thing, indeed. But the other things is, what are you going to do about the fact that now that you have a lot of vaccines, production is paused, some countries aren't even ready to give it. What do you think can be done to assist in getting the infrastructure necessary, in getting the people who are able to give these vaccines? And I mean, it doesn't have to be a physician or a nurse. It could be somebody who's trained to be able to deliver a vaccine. What are you going to do to make that happen? And secondly, what are you going to do about the supply chains problems at WTO? How are you working with WTO? What is the challenge? What is a blockage at WTO other than some countries not wanting to make some agreements that are necessary to get this to move forward?
So, Dr. Fry, is the question for me?
It's for both of you, actually, but you can start, Mr. Paquette.
Okay, good. So, first of all, vaccine hesitancy is something that needs to be taken seriously. And it differs from one country to another. the rationale why people may refuse or have concerns about getting vaccine or vaccinated is based on different elements that needs to be further, understood and described and explained. So I think that education remains the fundamentals to help people to slowly get more on board with immunizations. There is so much evidences. Science is so clear about the value of immunizations and vaccines. It's a question of making sure that we take the time to listen, we take the time to understand the concerns that are being raised, and then provide as much support as possible and give people the time to actually reflect on this and see the value. We've seen an increased number of people getting vaccinated as we see the pandemic, going on. We see people getting vaccines on a regular basis, and that has helped to convince others of the safety and the efficacy of the vaccine. I think that that's basically the fundamentals we need to address.
Okay, can you talk to me a little bit about what the challenges are with regard to supply chain problems? I know trade is one of it, and the WTO. Is the WTO addressing this, or is it stymied by some countries not wanting to do anything about it?
Well, it's really interesting because right now, as we have, significant capacity and access to vaccines, the real challenge is really the deployment of these vaccines in different countries. And if we take the example of our mRNA technology, there is a challenge related to the cold chain process. You need to make sure that the vaccine is being delivered, respecting very strict guidance in terms of, the cold chain. And as such, we've realized that some countries might not have the capabilities right now or in the past to actually be able to fully deliver as quickly as they would like to our vaccine. So this is a limitation that we need to be aware of. And our role is to help these countries to get the equipment required, for instance, ultra low freezers, to make sure that they could store the vaccines safely, and also how to optimally deploy the vaccines to their population. We always know that the last mile is very important. You need to make sure that you can provide the vaccines to where the people are. And that process is quite complex. And we need to probably have more investments in infrastructures there for these countries.
Thank you. Ms. Coombs, do you have anything to add to it? I know that Ms. Janu has asked you a lot about AstraZeneca and the thrombocytopenia issue, but I think, as I said before, one can argue, as you say, the risk-benefit, and basically, I think you've said that the benefit outweighed the risk. But are you having problems other than people being afraid to take this particular vaccine in some countries? Do you see any other ways? For instance, I wanted to hear some of you talk about the ability to train people to deliver vaccines, to put the needle in the arm. And it's not, you don't have to be a physician or nurse to do that. A lot of people can be trained to do that. How do you see this moving forward? Because, as variants change regularly, some of us are going to find that these vaccines aren't going to work. What is your answer to this?
And just a brief answer, please, in the interest of time.
Fair, yes. So quickly, I will say that I think as my colleague just talked about, that the different vaccines have different supply chains, and we have all learned how to distribute them at the local level. Well, I think your idea of being able to train folks to deliver it is actually a very good one, and something that as we all become even much more sophisticated in the business model, I believe that is an area that we will as kind of an ecosystem explore. I think you can also see that 2.6 billion doses from AstraZeneca have been distributed in kind of lower to mid-tier countries. It does show the difference between the supply chain and being able to get different types of medicines into local areas to actually be able to administer them.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Fry. Monsieur Bergeron, s'il vous plaît, pour 6 minutes.
Mr. Bergeron, you have 6 minutes. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. First, we have heard mid-March through the media that there was a compromise between the South Africa, United States, and the UN with respect to patents on COVID-19 vaccines, and that there might be an agreement with respect to intellectual property. And this is the TRIPS. So can you tell us if you've been associated with these discussions, and if you're able to tell us where these at what stage these discussions are at?
Go ahead, Fabien.
Okay.
Mr. Bejon, I will answer in French since you asked the question in French. Oh, if you'd done otherwise, I would have been shocked. So what you have to remember, and that has been clearly demonstrated, that the patent issue is really a false issue. In reality, it's not a question of protecting patents. What's necessary to be able to do, to be able to immunize and protect the whole population, is to be able to produce the vaccines rapidly and to be able to distribute them rapidly to where they're needed at a price that is working for those countries. And that's what Pfizer has done. We've maximized our production with the production chains we have around the world, and we were able to see that we were able to have a sliding scale price that would able to respond to the needs of the different countries, 3-tier of prices. So this is the best solution to be able to ensure that we can address this problem of the pandemic. So it's not really linked to any question of patents. I think that we have seen that. We've seen that the experts that do have the expert production capacity and are able to develop vaccines, those have done so, and they've concentrated their efforts in that arena. And I think that allowed us to put out vaccine that respond to the needs that we see now.
And I will just reiterate, because I very much support that same position, as we have seen that it's not the intellectual property that has slowed the availability of these vaccines across the globe, that it has been the complexity of the supply chain and the distribution of it. And as we see across all manufacturers, the partnership in the ecosystems that we've created to actually be able to get the medicine to the local level has really been key to our success.
Merci infiniment. D'ailleurs,
thank you very much. Your answers seem to confirm, or at least correspond to the answers that were given to us previously by Mr. Berkeley, Seth Berkeley, who is Chief Executive Officer of Gavi, talking about patents and intellectual property. There's a question of the knowledge needed to be able to produce these vaccines. But I would like to reiterate my question. It seems that there was an agreement, a compromise agreement, at least in terms of updating the committee. It seems that between the European Union, India, United States, and South Africa, there seems to be a compromise. And where are the negotiations with respect to those agreements? And what would be the possible advantages of those agreements be? Answer. If I could tell you, there have been discussions with the WHO, and Pfizer as a company is not involved in those discussions. Those are discussions that happen between the different countries. And if we are asked to give our perspective, we can offer it. But these are not conversations that Pfizer is involved in actively.
Madame Combs,
Madame Combs, would you like to add anything to that?
No, in the interest of brevity, I concur. AstraZeneca is in the same position as Pfizer.
Okay. Êtes-vous en mesure de nous dire si...
Thank you. Can you tell us if you've been consulted within the framework of those negotiations? Answer. We have a position that has been clearly mentioned to the effect that we do not believe that the patent issue was anything that was going to provide any solutions. But otherwise, we do let the countries negotiate among themselves. Our position has always been the same from the beginning. Madame Combs?
Again, I concur. The we're in the same position that I personally and our organization here in Canada has not engaged in these conversations and very much confirmed that the issue in our perspective is not intellectual property, but it is distribution.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Bergeron. Madame McPherson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I would like to thank our guests for being here today. I have to say I have a AstraZeneca vaccine in my arm. I also have a Pfizer vaccine in my arm. I also have a Moderna, which we don't have here. So I'm incredibly grateful for the opportunity to be vaccinated, of course, and echo what our colleagues have said about making sure that you take whatever vaccine is offered to you as fast as you can. Of course, I also have concerns about how the vaccines have been rolled out. I think we can all agree that it was not a perfect scenario, and I understand that it was done within an extremely unprecedented time and a very difficult time. But I do have some questions from the sector. I've met with many people who are concerned about how the vaccine is rolled out. And so I'm going to read this question if I could. Last year, rich countries were quickly vaccinating their population, often accumulating millions of excess doses. COVAX was struggling to access enough vaccines to fulfill its commitment to developing countries, who still now are much behind in terms of vaccination rates. I'm wondering if we could ask perhaps Mr. Paquette, could you tell us on what basis are Pfizer's deliveries prioritized? And were wealthy or richer countries who had bilateral deals with Pfizer able to push themselves to the front of the line because they paid more per dose?
Yeah, to start with this approach, when we saw that it was a pandemic, there were two components. The first one was, okay, we need to find the best possible way to address this pandemic by producing as quickly and as safely as possible vaccines. And to do so, we made sure that we have put all of our resources from an R&D standpoint to have our researchers in collaboration with BioNTech to actually discover and then do the research and development, the testing, the manufacturing, and then the distribution of the vaccines. So once you have this solution in your hands, you want to deploy it as largely as possible. And as such, we were reaching out to all the countries in the world to make sure that they would have an opportunity to sign an agreement with Pfizer. To be very transparent, some raised their hands right away. Others decided to wait a little bit, despite our tier pricing model. And as such, we were offering our vaccines to every country in the world, including COVAX countries, with COVAX, of course, to make sure that they would have access to it. But as I said, some countries have decided to sign with Pfizer right away.
So sorry, I'm so sorry to interrupt you, and I don't want to be rude, but you'll understand how pressed I am for time. So did wealthy countries who came forward first because they could pay that higher rate, were they able to access the vaccines faster? Were they able to be faster in the line?
They were having access to the vaccine as they were signing the agreements, like all the other countries. So there were countries who signed earlier on. I'll give you the example of Israel, who signed up front, and they were having access to the vaccines. Canada was among the countries who signed also up front. But if a low or middle income countries within COVAX wanted to have our vaccines, they were also having access to it as well. In these cases, the challenge most likely was more around the infrastructure to deploy the vaccines in these
Well, we know
countries.
that that's the case now, but at the beginning, we also know that it was actually the supply that was a problem. Can I also ask, what was the profit that Pfizer made with regards to the COVID vaccine? How much profit has Pfizer made?
I haven't had any details about the overall financials of the total sales or profits on this.
Sorry, you can't provide how much money Pfizer made by producing the COVID vaccine. Could you provide that to the committee at a later date in writing, please?
Oh, we can provide the total revenues. Yes, absolutely.
Thank you. The other thing I guess I wanted to ask a little bit about is the allowing of donations to other countries. So my understanding is that with the agreements that were in place, with the agreements that we had with Canada, or that Pfizer had with Canada, the government of Canada, that they were unable to donate the excess vaccines because of the restrictions put in place by Pfizer. Is that accurate?
No, this is inaccurate. I could very clearly mention that in our contractual agreement, there was a clause that is providing Canada to give doses of our vaccines if they want to. We need to, of course, have the conversation about how and when this could be done, but there were definitely an opportunity for Canada to actually deploy the Pfizer BioNTech vaccine.
And when was that clause added, or when was that possible? When was it first possible for Canada to donate Pfizer vaccines to other countries?
They were allowed to do it as soon as they were receiving vaccines. It was in the initial agreement, the first one that we signed with the country. That
conversation with you first, sorry?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, no, they just need to make sure that we need to keep in mind that when Canada started to receive vaccines, the priority of the public health agencies across all provinces was to deploy the vaccines locally. Now, having said that, at any time, there were an opportunity for Canada to engage with us to, ensure that there will be realignment of doses to lower middle income countries.
If the government of Canada bought those vaccines, why did we have to negotiate to where those vaccines went? Why was it not possible for us to donate them as soon or as late as we wanted to? We had paid for those vaccines.
Yes, absolutely. I think it's more a question of ensuring that we understand where where these vaccines would be going. We wanted to ensure, of course, that these countries have the capabilities to deploy the vaccines optimally. So it was more a discussion than anything else in that regards.
So, okay.
Ms. McPherson, I apologize. We'll have to leave it there. You'll have a chance to go in the second round, which we will get to next. Colleagues, we have time for a compressed second round, given the schedule, the timing. We have capacity to go until 1:15, but I understand that not every member is able to, so I want to be mindful of that consideration and also give every member a chance to ask at least one question. At the end, I'm going to ask you briefly for a housekeeping motion, which I think will be unanimously approved, but I need to have that motion for the clerk to be able to move forward on one of our projects. I would suggest 2-minute rounds, very quick questions and answers across the 6 members who are currently listed in round 2. And if that's amenable, Mr. Abdeltaif, would you lead us off for 2 minutes, please?
Sorry, it's a short time, but I'm going to try my best. Mr. Paquet, you have tier pricing policy. So 3 level of pricing. Was this pricing policy universal among all countries? Yes or no?
Yes, absolutely. That was at the beginning of the process that was established that way.
So the price at a wealthier nation would be equivalent to cost of a takeaway meal. What would that be?
Well, depending of the cost of the meal in that country, but as you can see, it's I would say more generally saying the cost of what we've seen generally speaking for flu vaccines.
But if the pricing were universal, that means they should be equal among all wealthy countries. Is that correct?
And depending of the countries, they were in tier 1, tier 2, or tier 3 prices.
Yeah, no. If let's say take tier 1, shouldn't be, let's say, Canada and United Kingdom pay the same price?
Well, not exactly the same price, but in the same ballpark figures, I would say, because I don't have access to other countries' prices, but I would say that that's what I understood it was the case.
Will you be able to advise or provide to us what Canada has paid for tier 1, 2, or 3?
Well, Canada has paid, as a tier 1 country, they had paid the price that was in the range of the tier 1 countries.
What was that price?
As you can realize here, there's been some confidentiality component in our agreements with the government of Canada.
Why?
And as such, I'm not allowed to disclose any prices.
Ms. Combs, do you have the same policy as far as pricing and pricing tiers and all that? Do you?
In Canada right now, we do not have a contract for Vaxzevria with the Canadian government.
So how did you sell us AstraZeneca? I'm an AstraZeneca vaccinated person.
Yeah, so at the time, at the height of the crisis, we did, and the pricing was a no profit pricing model.
What was that price? Since you have no contract,
I do not have the price right now here, and I would have to follow up.
If you could provide that to the committee, Ms. Combs, that would be helpful. Mr. Abdeltaif, thank you very much. Mr. Sorbera, please, for 2 minutes.
Thank you. I'll be short. Thank you, Chair. Just a quick question. The notion of vaccine hesitancy, something that I've seen we deal with in developed countries and developing countries. And I just wanted to follow up on that issue. I just want to say I'm an AstraZeneca first dose and Moderna second dose individual. So with that, what are you folks seeing on the ground that what works and what doesn't work in terms of getting over vaccine hesitancy?
Christine, you want to start?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and start, and then I'll turn it over to you. But quickly, I just think 2 observations. It's interesting because as you all self-identify as your vaccine what vaccine you've taken, I think that is a step in what is overcoming vaccine hesitancy in some way. It has become much more of a top of mind thought for all people everywhere as to kind of what they get vaccinated against and how. So I think just the increase in public attention has helped with that. I think we have more to do, and some of that is a balance of the media around how we talk about the risk benefit of being vaccinated in any disease state, but specifically in this case. And third, I think we do need to, at a grassroots effort, and specifically in certain populations, increase education.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that those were the two fundamental elements that Kirsten has talked about. Education is fundamental, and the capabilities of making sure that immunizers could also have the education for themselves to be able to provide the vaccines to their population.
Today, with the supply chain being impacted both by COVID and ongoing, and now with the unprecedented invasion of Ukraine by Putin, any comments on production issues that you may or may not be having at this moment?
And just a brief answer, please.
Yeah, at this point in time, we have absolutely no issues in terms of productions. We can still supply the vaccines around the world.
Merci beaucoup. Monsieur Bergeron, 2 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bergeron. 2 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Aboultaïf asked a question, and you said that at the worst point of the crisis, you had adopted a policy for providing a non-profit basis, the vaccine. And as we know that for AstraZeneca, Pfizer, for example, has declared that they never received any public money for the development of their vaccine. And in 2021, they had $37 billion in profit. So at what point did you choose to move from a nonprofit vision to a formula where you would be able to move ahead with profits?
I'm assuming is for me. Yeah.
Oui, bien sûr.
Yes, of course.
So through the entire pandemic stage, AstraZeneca offered the vaccine at no profit globally. And that also includes a significant amount of donations that have been made either through countries or directly on AstraZeneca's behalf. We, in the beginning of the year, and as we moved into an endemic phase, we moved to a tier pricing in countries that we have vaccine contracts with.
Et ce changement de...
And that change, the change of policy, change of practice, did that correspond to a loss, a presumed loss of profit, which would be equivalent to the public funding? And from that point in time, you decided that it was now time, since you felt you had taken into consideration the possible losses that they were equivalent to the public funding, that it was now time to make a profit?
So to briefly answer that, this change in pricing policy, which by the way still offers at low income countries a no profit option, right? We're still delivering it there. This policy and change has happened in just the recent months, and so there are no public financial implications that can be discussed at this time at a global level.
Merci
we have
beaucoup.
to wait a little bit longer.
Merci, Monsieur Bergeron.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Bergeron.
Again, to the witnesses for being here today. I wanted to follow up with our guest from AstraZeneca. You know, she spoke about this being a humanitarian crisis, and I greatly appreciate that, because I think we can all agree that this is a humanitarian crisis, and the challenge we have with the rollout of the vaccines, of course, is that it very much appears like the profit motive has trumped the humanitarian crisis and the need for people around the world to be able to access the vaccines. So I am disappointed, I have to say, that you aren't able to share some of the numbers with us. So I certainly look forward to receiving those numbers from you and writing it at a later date. We do have information that Pfizer has made, for example, approximately, it's been reported about $37 billion in profit with COVID-19. With the COVID-19 vaccine. And I'm just wondering whether or not either of you could, that and also the public dollars that, of course, have gone into the development of the AstraZeneca vaccine, I'm just wondering if either of you can talk a little bit about when it will be enough money for you, when it will be enough money that you will be able to give the vaccines to people around the world to ensure that that is available to them. Because my concern, obviously, is that right now we have lots of vaccines and we're experiencing hesitancy and we're experiencing other reasons why the vaccines are hard to get into people's arms. But we all know that at the beginning of this pandemic, there weren't enough vaccines, and that went to wealthy countries, that went to countries that overlapped, that took the supply from COVAX, and the pharmaceutical companies made massive profits. So if another pandemic was to come, if another variant of this pandemic was to come forward, how do we know that the exact same thing wouldn't happen in the future?
And just very briefly, please.
I think that the entire industry, and specifically our organizations, have shown that we are in this fight with the entire system. And the idea here is not necessarily to make money per se on the vaccine, but it is to continue to invest in the development of our vaccines as to your point, need to evolve, right? As variants come, it requires investment in an R&D perspective to actually be able to continue to evolve the vaccine to be effective. And so I think that there is a balance between how do we continue to vaccinate the world and continue to make sure that we have medicine and good science that is evolving not only to treat the variant, but also hopefully at some point have an easier mechanism of delivery that is able to transport across the globe in a more efficient manner.
We'll have to leave it there. Thanks very much. Mr. Genuis, please, for 2 minutes.
This question is for both witnesses. We'll start with Ms. Coombs. A previous witness has told us that the global distribution of vaccine is subject to indemnification clauses that countries have to sign on to, meaning that if something goes wrong, your companies are shielded from liability. People cannot sue if they experience or perceive they have experienced vaccine injuries. Instead, any compensation would be paid out by a no-fault mechanism funded by COVAX, to which industry does not contribute. This witness further told us that you had asked for this protection as part of your agreements. So could you please explain why your company asked for indemnification clauses, why public bodies should assume those liabilities, and whether these indemnification clauses would apply in cases where information had been withheld by your company with respect to risks?
So I'm not privileged as to specifically the indemnification clause in the contract that you speak of. What I can say is that AstraZeneca stands behind our medicines and the safety profile of our medicines. And so,
ma'am, sorry to jump in, but you're the Canadian president of the company here, and you're telling me you're not aware of the details of the indemnification clauses. We're told that you asked for them. So why did you ask for them?
I asked for the indemnification clause on the Vaxzevria contract with Canada. So I'm clear.
We were told by a previous witness who's affiliated with Gavi that industry representatives asked for indemnification clauses as part of contracts for the global distribution of vaccines. Why?
I think that indemnification clauses in all of my time in the pharmaceutical industry is standard part of contracting. The specific details in which you talk about, I just am not I don't have the knowledge to answer.
Enough at all, but I wonder if Mr.
Sorry,
Paquette can
we'll
come in on that.
There. Thanks very much. Mr. Sassi, please, for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to share my time with MP Vandenbelt.
Yes, thank you very much. I'd like to just ask a different question that hasn't come up yet at this point. And we know that right now, certainly in the Global South, testing and treatment are becoming vitally important. And in terms of treatment, the antivirals, I'm looking at Paxlovid and some of the others, these are becoming very, very important. But we're also seeing some evidence, and I'm not a scientist, but there seems to be some anecdotal evidence that this could also be effective in terms of long COVID. And we're looking at a pandemic right now, but we know that the debilitating long-term effects of COVID are still not known, and there will need to be treatments for that as well. Are you putting any money and research into antivirals, into long COVID, and how do you see this as being something that could help in terms of the Global South and where the pandemic is going next? Pfizer first, please.
Yeah, we are actually, and thank you for the questions, we are actually investing significantly to look at further options. We have Paxlovid, as you've mentioned, which is an important treatment that is available right now around the world. And of course, we need to continue the research. We need to look at other studies to see what will be the impact of Paxlovid on the long COVID. Now, as we're doing this, we're also continuing some research to see if there is anything else that could be used eventually to address the long COVID issues.
Also, search for this?
Yeah, so as I talked about in my opening statements, we have brought, we are in the process of making available a long-acting antibody really for the prevention of COVID in patients who don't mount an immune response to the vaccine, which I think is really important for an untreated population today. And the commitment to longer-term development in this space is something that AstraZeneca is doing.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Ms. Van Belt. Colleagues, on our collective behalf, I'd like to thank our witnesses of the second
Sorry,
panel.
point of order, Mr. Chair. If we have till 1:15, you might find consent of the committee for every party to have another 90 seconds.
Is there unanimous consent? I know some colleagues have obligations, they've advised me, but is there unanimous consent for another 90-second round per member?
I think no. I think my understanding is that adjournment is by consent of a majority. You don't need,
if we can
you
trigger a
don't need
majority
unanimous
to extend, that's certainly within the will of the committee, if you can generate that. I don't know if there is. And we do have another point of business that I'm hoping to get the committee's agreement on.
I suspect there's a will of a majority of the committee for every party to have another 90 seconds.
Can we do a quick thumbs up, thumbs down? 90 seconds per member. There's 2 thumbs down, 3, 4. Monsieur Bergeron has to leave as well, I think. Monsieur Bergeron?
En effet, Monsieur le Président.
That's right, Mr. Chair.
That's the way we shape the will of the committee. Thank you for the suggestion. Colleagues, let me thank you on our collective behalf. Let me thank the witnesses on our collective behalf. Ms. Coombs and Monsieur Paquette, merci beaucoup. Thank you for being with us. Thank you for your work and your expertise this afternoon. Colleagues, 2 things. One is a point of information as we let our witnesses disconnect. The analysts are going to circulate through the clerk a proposal for committee travel. There's a deadline on Friday. Submissions at the top level have to be brought to the liaison committee if the committee wishes to travel from the end of June through September, October. So they will prepare that for discussion and potential approval on Thursday. The other thing I need is a motion and agreement of the committee to hear the delegation from Tibet that we have advised of through the vice chairs. I think there is unanimous consent, as far as I can tell, to have that meeting. We need a formal motion and approval for the clerk to be able to organize that meeting. Can somebody bring that motion? Mr. Chung? Okay, so moved. Any opposition? Okay, I think we have agreement on that. Colleagues, thank you very much. And with
Chair,
that,
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. Chair? I'm sorry, Mr. Bergeron.
Monsieur Chung, puis-vous?
Okay, j'ai une question.
I have a question. What is the travel that you have proposed for the committee? There are certain ideas. Voyage to the Eastern Europe.
The analysts will, through the clerk, send us proposals. It's not me that's writing them, but we will have some proposals.
Thank you.
Mr. Paquette,
Monsieur Bergeron, la parole à vous.
Mr. Bergeron, the floor is yours. Yes, Mr. Chair, I simply wanted to know what was happening with the witness that we were supposed to hear from the World Trade Organization that we haven't heard. Today's witness? Mr. Bergeron, today's witness? Yes, Mr. Chair. I don't have any information. I don't know if there's another option to incorporate that witness into another spot.
We are adjourned until our next meeting. Merci beaucoup.